Good afternoon, I'm Leila Massimova and you're watching A News. Now the major stories making headlines today. Ukraine and the US sign memorandum on minerals deals, top Ukraine official says. High-level officials from the US, Europe and Ukraine met, pushing for a collaborative approach for peace. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan signals readiness to amend constitution, addresses Azerbaijan's final peace condition. Ukraine and the United States are entering a new phase of an economic cooperation. A recently signed memorandum outlines plans to establish an investment fund and tap into Ukraine's rich natural resources. US President Donald Trump says access to these resources is of a strategic importance for overcoming the crisis caused by the war.
Ukraine and the United States have taken an important step toward the country's economic recovery and development. On April 17th, they signed a memorandum of intent that paves the way for an economic partnership and the creation of an investment fund for Ukraine. Ukraine's first Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy, Yulia Sviridenko, shared the news on social media. She said the document is vital for rebuilding infrastructure, supporting businesses and creating new economic opportunities. Sviridenko also highlighted the US support for Ukraine's independence and security. She noted that the American people are ready to invest in Ukraine's recovery. The memorandum also draws attention to Ukraine's rich natural resources, especially critical minerals like lithium, titanium and uranium. These are in high demand in Europe and the US. The US aims to secure access to these resources, especially during the ongoing war. US President Donald Trump emphasized his special interest in Ukraine's natural resources, stating that gaining greater access to these resources is important for overcoming the crisis caused by the war.
I'm dealing with President Zelensky. I'm dealing with President Putin. I'm trying to get the money back or secured because, Europe has given $100 billion. The United States has given $350 billion because we had a stupid, incompetent president and administration. 350. But here's worse. Europe gave it in the form of a loan. They get their money back. We gave it in the form of nothing. So I want them to give us something for all of the money that we put up.
First of all, our knowledge base on the Ukrainian resources, rare earths, titanium, manganese, and others, is not sufficient. So we need more information about the commodities which are located in Ukraine. First. Second, a huge problem for the US is that there are not so many American companies who are able to mine and to process these rare earth elements, because since almost 2 decades, Chinese companies dominate this sector. So it's easy to say on a political level, let's get these critical elements from Ukraine. But on a practical level, it's not so far clear which companies, Americans, British or German or whatever companies, will be able to do this right now when the war continues.
This agreement holds great importance for both Ukraine and the US economically and geopolitically. The use of Ukraine's natural resources is a strategic issue for Western countries. The memorandum goes beyond economic cooperation. It is also a key step towards supporting Ukraine's independence, security and future development.
US President Donald Trump says China has reached out after the latest round of tariffs. While he stopped short of confirming direct talks with President Xi Jinping, Trump says communication is happening at high levels. Trump said that a deal with Beijing is likely, but warned that if not, the US will move forward on its own terms. He also announced a delay on the TikTok agreement, saying it will wait until trade issues are resolved. The US currently has tariffs totaling 145% on China's goods.
I have a very good relationship with President Xi, and I think it's going to continue. And I would say they have reached out a number of times.
Xi or they?
Well, the same. I view it very similar. It would be top levels of China. And if you knew him, you would know that if they reached out, he knew everything about it. He runs it very tight, very strong, very smart. And we're talking to China. Well, we have a deal for TikTok, but it'll be subject to China, so we'll just delay the deal till this thing works out one way or the other. And I think it's a good deal for China. The TikTok deal is very good. TikTok is good for China, and I think they'd like to see us do a deal, especially the deal that we have pretty much done with some of the best companies in the world.
Analysts warn that the trade war between the US and China might affect the supply of rare earth minerals critical to the US military. China's restrictions could impact many defense and aerospace companies, giving Beijing a strategic advantage. Joining us now is Jonathan Baksha-Miller, Principal at Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory from Ottawa, Canada. Thank you for being with us, Mr. Miller.
About that. Thank you very much, Leila, and nice to join you.
So, as you know, tensions in the trade war have escalated quickly, given China's near monopoly on refined rare earth minerals critical for US military tech and consumer electronics. So how much leverage does Beijing really have over Washington?
Well, I think they have a significant amount of leverage when it comes to critical and rare earths. And there's two factors there. First of it's the actual supply of rare earths. So they have over 70% of those minerals and critical materials themselves. The second important factor is the refining part of it. So it's not just having access to those minerals, but it's being able to refine them. And as your previous guest correctly mentioned when talking about Ukraine, most of the companies that focus on refining some of these important critical minerals and rare earths that are necessary for military components and high-tech sensors comes from China. So it's definitely a point of leverage. And I think when we see the fruitions of this trade deal, or however the US and China try to get into negotiations on trade and tariffs, I think the non-tariff barriers and some of the other points of leverage, including critical materials and rare earth, will definitely be a factor.
Thanks again for joining us, Mr. Miller. Your perspective was so insightful. The price of everyday essentials like Nike's, Levi's jeans and Gap t-shirts could soon spike in the US as fresh tariffs threaten the Asian factories at the heart of a global clothing supply chain. A wave of new trade measures is already disrupting key manufacturing hubs like China, Vietnam and Indonesia.
The American consumer may soon feel the pinch as new tariffs reshape global trade dynamics. In 2024, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia accounted for 95% of all Nike footwear production, a staggering concentration now under threat. The U.S. has already slapped significant tariffs on Chinese goods, while Vietnam and Indonesia face 10% tariffs that could rise by July unless new trade deals are reached. Vietnam is particularly in the spotlight, suspected of being an indirect entry point for Chinese goods, either through rerouted shipments or by incorporating Chinese components into exports. This has placed Vietnam and companies dependent on its supply chains, like Gap, in a precarious position. Gap shares have dropped 14% since President Trump's tariff announcement on April 2nd. Nike has seen a 14.7% decline, and Levi's stock is down 10.6%. But the impact doesn't end with fashion. Technology companies are also deeply connected with Chinese manufacturing. Nearly 90% of gaming consoles sold in the US, from Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo, are assembled in China. Apple continues to outsource most of its assembly operations there. NVIDIA, a leader in AI and graphics technology, relies on Chinese components and contracts Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company to produce its chips. Meanwhile, American agriculture is bracing for another hit. During the first U.S.-China trade war from 2018 to 2019, U.S. farmers lost billions in revenue. Now, history may repeat itself. Analysts warn that about 15% of U.S. farm exports went to China in 2024, with the soybean industry especially vulnerable as China remains its largest buyer. As tensions rise and stock prices tumble, the economic impact of these tariffs is set to ripple across multiple sectors, from the clothes we wear to the tech we use and the food we grow.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused China of supplying weapons and gunpowder to Russia, his first direct claim of China's military support in the war. Speaking at a press conference in Kyiv, Zelensky said intelligence also suggests China is producing weapons on Russian territory. Moscow and Beijing haven't yet commented on these accusations. However, China has previously denied any involvement in the war. The allegations threatens to further strain relations between Kyiv and Beijing, as China continues to present itself as a neutral despite strong economic ties with Moscow.
I think it's important information. It's not very pleasant. We finally received information that China is supplying weapons to the Russian Federation, and we are ready to talk about it in detail. Today, we have general information from the security service, from reconnaissance, and I think we will be able to talk about it in great detail next week, especially about the data that we believe that Chinese representatives are engaged in the production of some weapons on the territory of Russia.
China has denied supplying lethal weapons to Russia, calling Ukraine's accusations groundless. Beijing rejected the accusation, saying it strictly controls military exports and that most weapon components used by Russia come from the US and other Western countries. Beijing also reaffirmed its position on the conflict, emphasizing its support for a ceasefire and peaceful negotiations. A missile strike has hit the northeastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv on Friday morning, killing one person and injuring more than 100 others, according to local authorities. The attack comes as both sides accuse each other of violating a US brokered ceasefire on energy infrastructure.
5 children were among those injured in Friday's attack on Kharkiv, which killed one person and injured more than 70 people. That's according to local authorities, which says apartment buildings, an educational institution and a civilian enterprise were damaged. Kharkiv Mayor Ihor Terekhov says at least 15 residential buildings were hit. Residents say it was a frightening time.
We were asleep. I saw some kind of flash. I don't know. Everything flew around. There was smoke. My wife took our daughter from the room there and gave her to me. We covered her in a blanket. We first thought the blood on her was mine, but then we found out that she had a shrapnel injury near her eye.
Everything was tossed around in every single room. Glass shattered everywhere. Just everything.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has shifted its focus from targeting energy sites to hitting civilian infrastructure. It's despite a US brokered ceasefire agreement which put energy facilities off limits. Though Moscow reduced direct attacks on the power grid, Zelensky warned the overall volume of missile and drone strikes remains unchanged. At a United Nations Security Council meeting on Thursday, Russia claimed Ukraine has launched more than 120 strikes on its energy infrastructure, which Kyiv denies.
U.S. held diplomatic talks in Paris on Thursday, an encouraging reception. The discussions to end the war in Ukraine focused on a key proposal for a multinational force for up to 30 countries to oversee and effect a future agreement. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's office calls the talks constructive and positive. And President Donald Trump says Kyiv and Washington could sign a minerals and economic cooperation deal as soon as next week.
European powers say they're keen to ensure their role in shaping the future of Ukraine. High-level officials from the US, Europe and Ukraine met in Paris on Thursday, pushing for a collaborative approach for peace. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff with senior officials from France, Britain and Germany. The so-called E3 were at the Élysée Palace. A key proposal was the creation of a multinational peacekeeping force, potentially involving up to 30 countries. However, its deployment depends on US military support, which has not yet been confirmed. A senior advisor to French President Emmanuel Macron called the talks honest and open. The talks will continue next week.
The Europeans, the Ukrainians and the Americans who have agreed to meet next week in London to continue discussions on this basis so that we can hope in the very near future to achieve a full and complete unconditional ceasefire, to which the Ukrainians have already agreed and to which we hope Russia will agree in turn.
While the discussions in Paris were viewed as progress, it remains unclear whether all parties will agree to the proposed terms. French President Emmanuel Macron says it's important for European and Ukrainian unity.
And I think this is a very important occasion to have convergence with our Ukrainian friends and amongst the Europeans alongside with you, because I think everybody wants to get peace, for sure, and a robust and sustainable peace. And this is it. I think we clearly all pursue, and now the question is about the phasing, the way to approach this resolution, which is the one we do wish.
Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told Rubio that Moscow was ready to continue joint work with Washington to eliminate the long-standing causes of the Ukraine conflict. The upcoming meeting in London is seen as an important step in ensuring the peace talks remain fair and balanced as both sides navigate the complexities of the conflict.
Thank you very much. That's a very cool.
Following talks with European and Ukrainian leaders, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the U.S. is ready to support a peace effort if progress is evident within days, but will shift its focus elsewhere if it is not.
But we're not going to continue with this endeavor for weeks and months on end. So we need to determine very quickly now, and I'm talking about a matter of days, whether or not this is doable over the next few weeks. If it is, we're in. If it's not, then we have other priorities to focus on as well. So if they're serious about peace, either side or both, we want to help. If it's not going to happen, then we're just going to move on.
Hungary say it expects to sign a business deal with the U.S. that could help to offset the likely impact of tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. That's what Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán told local media.
In 6 months' time, Hungary says it is expecting to finalize a trade deal with the U.S. to help cushion the impact of President Donald Trump's tariffs. That's what Prime Minister Viktor Orbán told local news media called OT on Thursday.
As far as we are concerned, we are in talks with the Americans about economic issues which would be advantageous for us. The tariffs will be negative for us, but we negotiate about other economic deals to offset those tariffs.
As a member of the European Union, Hungary relies heavily on its car industry, a key driver of its economy. However, the sector could suffer under new tax hikes, especially as Hungary grapples with a slower than expected economic recovery and rising inflation ahead of 2026 elections. Under Trump's current policy, the EU faces 25% tariffs on cars, steel, and aluminium, as well as border levies on most other goods. Viktor Orban has been a close Trump ally for more than a decade. He believes Republicans will stay in power for 12 years, advancing what he described as a patriot Republican vision for America.
U.S. airstrikes on Yemen's Ras Al port has killed at least 58 people and injured more than 120 others, according to Houthis-run media. The U.S. Central Command confirmed the strike, saying it targeted a key fuel supply point for the Iran-backed militants. The attack aimed to weaken the Houthis by cutting off a major source of illicit revenue funding their operations. Meanwhile, Israel say the Houthis later launched a missile toward Tel Aviv, which was intercepted. The conflict continues to escalate, with the U.S. also accusing a Chinese satellite firm of aiding Houthi attacks, a claim Beijing has yet to comment on. Armenia has voted in favor of a United Nations resolution condemning Russia's aggression against Ukraine. The resolution, which passed with 105 votes, calls for stronger cooperation between the UN and the Council of Europe. It also backs the creation of a special tribunal for Russia's war crimes in Ukraine. The US and Russia were among the 9 countries that voted against it, while 33 countries abstained. Armenia had previously abstained from similar resolutions multiple times, but this marks its first public criticism of Russia's actions. Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan has officially declared his government's intention to remove references to territorial claims on Karabakh from the country's constitution, a long-standing demand from Azerbaijan in the ongoing peace process.
Prime Minister of Armenia Nikol Pashinyan stated that Armenia's new constitution should exclude references to the 1990 Declaration of Independence, which has been seen as the legal and ideological basis for claims over Azerbaijani territories. Although the current constitution does not explicitly mention the annexation of Karabakh, it references the declaration, which cites the 1991 decision by separatist forces to join Armenia. Azerbaijan has consistently insisted that the removal of such references is a prerequisite for signing a final peace agreement. Despite a general consensus on the treaty's content, Baku maintains that it will not sign the deal until the Armenian constitution no longer implies territorial claims. Azerbaijan also continues to demand a joint statement declaring the dissolution of the OC Minsk Group's mandate. Pashinyan has now instructed officials to begin drafting a new constitution to be put to a national referendum, tentatively scheduled for May 2026 to coincide with parliamentary elections. The Prime Minister justified the decision on internal political and legal grounds rather than external pressure, suggesting the declaration's principles contradict Armenia's current statehood. Nevertheless, domestic challenges persist. Opposition forces in Armenia, some of which continue to leverage the Karabakh issue, are seeking to undermine the government's legitimacy ahead of the vote. Forecasts suggest that the Pashinyan's party may struggle to retain a parliamentary majority, placing the referendum's outcome in doubt. Meanwhile, Armenia has linked the dissolution of the OC Minsk Group to the peace treaty's finalization, a stance Baku opposes. Azerbaijani officials argued that all conflict resolution mechanisms must be dismantled if the conflict is officially declared over. Pashinyan's recent remarks reflect a shift in political tone, Yet, experts note that real progress hinges on two developments: formal approval of the new constitution and the removal of all remaining structures tied to the conflict, including the Minsk Group. Without these, a lasting peace agreement remains elusive.
To discuss recent developments in Armenia and their implications for the Azerbaijan-Armenian peace process, joining us now is Shujat Ahmedzadeh, independent researcher from Baku, Azerbaijan. Shujat, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Analysts have been extensively analyzing, perhaps even over-analyzing, Armenian Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan's latest statements on the remaining obstacles towards the conclusion of a peace deal with Azerbaijan. In real terms, was there anything new?
Well, once again, Prime Minister Pashinyan has touched upon things that have so far been on the table. That is the dissolution of OSCE's Minsk Group, as well as removal of removal of any reference to Azerbaijan's territories into Armenia's legal body, which includes constitution's preamble and other documents. I think it is fair to say that it seems that Minsk Group's evolution is seemingly more possible at this point, given Armenian Prime Minister also indicated that they are ready for that, but I'm not sure. But I think in terms of timing, there could be other modalities discussed. As for the legal obstacles, I think it's important to note that it is finally acknowledged that in a new body of constitution, there will be no reference to the 1990 Declaration of Independence, which has in itself a reference to a declaration by the late Armenian authorities to a so-called unification of Karabakh with Armenia, which in itself is a new major turning point in Armenian position.
And interestingly enough, Armenia has recently stated that Turkey could act as the mediator between Yerevan and Baku. Is this somehow connected with the Turkish-Armenian normalization?
Yes, certainly. After in the last few, let's say, months, especially in the last 1 year, we have seen a completely new Armenian-Turkish relations. As though they're not diplomatically there, but there exists a sort of interactions through the special envoys. And Armenia, as of now, is trying to prioritize its opening of borders with Turkey because, as you know, Armenian economy, according to many economic analysts and others, would gain significant things in positive terms from opening up these borders. So given the small country like Armenia would gain a lot of things in terms of energy, commercial trade, and other resources from its trade with Turkey, let alone if we also combine it with Azerbaijan. So that would be a massive economic era, new era for Armenia's development. That's why they're trying to prioritize their pivot to Ankara to a certain degree.
And what impact might Armenia's internal political dynamics and opposition campaigns have on the success of the 2026 constitutional referendum and the broader peace process?
Yeah, I think that's why it's important to focus on not only one sort of a paper, but rather sort of a wider societal process in which also there is a kind of structural work on removing antagonism between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, within Armenia, also within Azerbaijan. In Armenia, for example, it's important to focus on how new Armenian identity could be rebuilt after a decades-long conflict with Azerbaijan over Karabakh. So this possible local bottom-up resistance could be eliminated. And that requires a political will, that requires a lot of massive transformation efforts by Armenian authorities through the mass education, mass media, through a new identity, which I think Armenian Prime Minister is somehow trying to push under the pretext of a real Armenia versus historical Armenia. These are the debates there. Whether they will succeed, we'll see. I think the peace process with Azerbaijan will also have a very positive effect on the process within Armenia. If we get the deal signed and subsequent processes across building relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan, then we could easily say that that would be very beneficial for this kind of vision also getting strengthened in Armenia.
This was Shujaat Ahmadzadeh, independent researcher from Baku, Azerbaijan. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian is scheduled to visit Azerbaijan on the 28th of April, accompanied by a large delegation focused on boosting economic ties. According to Iran's Chamber of Commerce, that delegation will include around 110 representatives from the private sector, particularly from Ardabil and other northwestern provinces. Some members of the group are expected to arrive in Baku ahead of the president's visit. Talks are expected to focus on cross-border trade, regional cooperation and investment opportunities. Turkey has pledged major support to Syria's rebuilding efforts following the end of the 13-year civil war and the fall of the Assad regime. On an official visit to Damascus, Turkey's Trade Minister Ömer Bolat laid out plans for wide-ranging cooperation on trade, infrastructure and institutional development.
Turkey says it will help Syria develop institutional capacity and address infrastructure deficiencies. The announcement was made by Trade Minister Ömer Bolat on Thursday during an official visit to Damascus. He spent 2 days in the Syrian capital meeting with top government officials and business leaders. The trip focused on reviving cooperation in trade, customs, transportation, investment, finance, banking, contracting and energy partnerships. Bolat held talks with the country's economy and industry minister Nidal Al-Shar, Finance Minister Mohammad Yasser Barnia, Transportation Minister Yarub Suleiman Badr, and the head of the land and sea ports, Qutayba Ahmad Badawi. During the meetings, Bolat congratulated Syrian officials on what he described the country's December the 8th revolution, which marked the end of a devastating civil war that had ripple effects across the region, including in Turkey. Speaking to members of the Damascus Chamber of Commerce, Bolat pledged Turkey's full support for Syria's reconstruction efforts.
Infrastructure, economic legislation and institutional capacity are now being re-established in Syria, and the government of Turkey will support the development of institutional capacity and infrastructure deficiencies to the extent requested by the Syrian government. Like all ministries in Turkey, we have been instructed by our president to support Syria. The establishment of a new free Syria here will be your work, and we, as your Muslim brothers and neighbors, have the duty to support you.
Bolat says that Turkey stands ready to share its experience and technological capabilities with the Syrian people. This visit signals a major step forward in regional cooperation and Turkey's readiness to support the country's path to recovery.
That's all for now. Thanks for spending your time with A News. Until next time.